Welcome back to The Place of Places, a chapter-by-chapter analysis of William Saroyan's 1972 memoir, Places Where I've Done Time. Today, we check into the Raphael Hotel, Paris, 1959. We've returned to a tricky time in Saroyan's life, the 1950s. He was already having financial problems and would soon permanently move to Paris, in part to avoid some hefty taxes he owed to the IRS and because he thought he could earn some money in Europe. He took a job with The Big Movie Man, rewriting a crime and court story. The story was purchased, but The Big Movie Man thought it could be further improved. Saroyan requests a hotel room in Paris to do the writing. The studio couldn't find a cheaper hotel, so they put him in the fancy Raphael, where he improved the script and then some. The Big Movie Man was pleased, but never paid the enormous hotel bill, so Saroyan did. The Big Movie Man was Darryl Zanuck, former and future head of 20th Century Fox Studios. During this time period, he was independently producing, with financing from Fox. The crime and court story was Settled Out of Court, a play written by Henry Cecil. Zanuck wanted it punched up and assigned that task to Saroyan. Saroyan took a stab at it and found it incredibly boring, but he saw potential in it and did a full rewrite, retitling it Fair Trial at Gunpoint. The rewrite wasn't accepted, though. Saroyan was paid for his work and credited, though. The play was presented in London mostly as Cecil had written it, which annoyed Saroyan. Still, he had made money, and it was during this time period that he was losing thousands of dollars at the Aviation Club, a private casino in Paris. I met Darryl Zanuck in Paris in May of 1959 when I went to his apartment at the Plaza Athénée to keep an appointment to tell him I was broke. Owed the tax collector a lot of money and therefore needed to earn a lot. Zanuck was a gambler well versed in losing money too, and there may have been some empathy and softness there for Saroyan. Frustrated that his girlfriend, French actress Juliette Gréco, wasn't achieving stardom, Zanuck set up Saroyan to design a vehicle for her. He too was living in Paris. At that time it was common for plays to be written, briefly performed, and optioned for a film, which means a producer purchases the rights to the intellectual property. This was the plan for Settled Out of Court, and it would be the plan for Saroyan's play, The Dogs, or the Paris Comedy, which was first titled Lily Dauphin. Saroyan wrote this specifically to feature Gréco as a way of ingratiating himself to Zanuck. The Paris Comedy did succeed in Vienna, translated into German, but that was the extent of its run. Negotiations for payment went awry, however, with Zanuck and Saroyan frustrating each other, and it was never made into a film. Saroyan and Zanuck had met during World War II, as Zanuck also served in a film propaganda capacity at Astoria Studios in Queens. But Hollywood wasn't a large town, and Saroyan hadn't made many friends there, apart from Stanley Rose and John Fante. Early in the 1930s, Saroyan had attempted to write scripts, scenarios, and stories for movies, submitting them to producers and receiving many rejections. He wrote in I Used to Believe I Had Forever, Now I'm Not So Sure, "As far as movies are concerned, I just don't know the score." Even after achieving international fame, after The Daring Young Man on the Flying Trapeze was released, he still received rejections from producers. His style bordered on the surreal at times, and that just wasn't what Hollywood was looking for. Of movies both international and domestic, he claimed they were earnest with no right to be. This unintentionally comic earnestness is partly responsible for the enormity of my ineptitude as a movie writer, although I have no desire to put the blame where it doesn't belong. He had written an outline called Ooh La La, or The Shot Writer, and submitted it to Zanuck's team, only to be totally ignored. The outline and descriptive material about it are presented in I Used to Believe I Had Forever, Now I'm Not So Sure, somewhat as a joke. The timeline that Saroyan sets out in this chapter doesn't exactly align with the timeline of the same period given by his biographer, John Leggett, in 2002. Saroyan tells us he had been staying at the La Pérouse Hotel in Paris before moving to the Raphael, while Leggett suggests Saroyan stayed at La Pérouse afterward, This is common in places where I've done time, where names and places aren't consistent even with others of Saroyan's memoirs. This is immaterial to the purpose of the book, though, but we hungrily study his timelines to recreate these events in his life as faithfully as possible. Either way, he had been at the Georges Cinq, lost too much money gambling to afford it, and then found himself at the Raphael expecting 20th Century Fox and Zanuck to pick up the bill. The Raphael was a luxurious Art Deco hotel built in 1925, serving the rich and famous and politicians. He asks the staff who usually stayed in the large, extravagant rooms, and the answer was, royalty and such, people with servants. During World War II, the Raphael had been requisitioned as the home for senior officials in the SS, Gestapo, and the Wehrmacht, and Saroyan may have known this when asking. He wrote the Paris comedy in a little under 2 weeks, and was stuck with most of the hotel bill. He ends this chapter, months later, the hotel informed me that the bill had not been paid by the producer, who insisted that I must pay it. I paid it. I'll never be a millionaire, that's all. This is a point that Saroyan comes back to often in his memoirs. Any money he made, he gambled away, and this was the impetus to keep writing, to make more money, to pay off his debts. However, the IRS saw his earnings and not his gambling losses, so the taxes remained hefty, and the gambling couldn't be written off. Saroyan gambled with many of his peers, friends, cousins, anyone around, including Zanuck, but he couldn't get a handle on the balance. This was known to publishers and producers in Hollywood and on Broadway, and although Saroyan was a fun guy to gamble with, they knew it was a vice that was destroying his career. Because of these losses, he did create a lot of writing output, though the quality even he suspected was low at times. This was in part due to the fact that he hated writing on demand and for other people's specific projects, and this pride led to lazy writing for others. In 1959, he wrote multiple plays, short stories, the memoir Not Dying, and a memoir he intended to call 50/50 in honor of his half-century birthday, but which was never released. Its parts came to be Here Comes, There Goes You Know Who, released in 1961. He was prolific and motivated, but not inspired. He was also struggling with the aftermath of his messy divorce from Carol, her remarriage, and challenging relationships with his children, who stayed with him for summer breaks. Pause the video here to read Saroyan's opinion on writing for Zanuck at this time. In this chapter, he refers to Zanuck as the big movie man and the big man, and in other descriptions has him with a dainty mustache, which compared to Saroyan in later years it sort of was. The emasculating of his rivals was a frequent attack Saroyan made, especially on those who were his financial superiors, and whom he resented for that fact. We see this throughout this book with a feckless landlord in New York and Lee Schubert at the Belasco Theater. Though he was not a hyper-masculine man, his insults often had to do with weakness. Where he was strong of mind, he hated the rich for hiding behind their money. Zanuck wasn't the worst offender in this case, though, and eventually Saroyan came to admit that, despite their checkered professional past, he respected Zanuck because of the money he spent on his writers. While it seemed like a lot of money to a writer, it wasn't much compared to other costs of production, and Zanuck could use this to his advantage, gaining loyalty from his writers. Zanuck had started in Hollywood as a writer before moving into management at age 27. A lot of writers hate Darryl Zanuck, and sometimes, remembering something or other in my dealings with him, I do too, but he was really a good man, and I refuse not to say so. This chapter highlights Saroyan's trouble with producers, inability to manage his money, and pride in his own ability to write something quickly and to improve the works of others. He never lost faith in his writing, even when he knew he had submitted a dud. He was a career writer, doing little else in his life besides gambling. And it was this professionalism that he was proudest of. He was paid, for decades, to do something that his family doubted he could make money at when he was young. The keeping of money was a frustration, but the product and volume was something Saroyan knew nobody could deny. He was a workhorse, and he knew his legacy would be monumental, which was the reason that he set up the William Saroyan Foundation while he was alive in 1966 to preserve and archive his enormous collection of manuscripts and personal papers, now mostly held at Stanford University. though his papers are scattered in smaller collections in universities across the country, and in the hands of private collectors. He knew he had no mind for money or any other part of adult living, but he was laser-focused on his craft. This chapter illustrates those points and reminds us that art is the purest form of the human condition.
You've not told here the Darrell Zanuck story. This is not that story. This is the story of the producers, the directors, the writers, the stars, the cameramen, and the technicians that I have been associated with at Warner Brothers and at 20th Century Fox. I've been in a position of leadership, but without their ideas, genius, talent, and loyalty, I could not possibly be here tonight. No, this is not a one-man show, Ed, nor am I being modest in admitting it.
Let's put this on the Saroyan map and move on.